Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for what I believe will be a reflective, enlightening, educative session on reversing cultural erosion. One of my favorite openings to a speech is the one that Amilcar Cabral gave on February 20th, 1970, as part of a series of lectures in memory of Eduardo Mondlane, the assassinated leader of the Mozambican Liberation Front. The now famous title of Cabral's speech was National Liberation and Culture. And this is how it begins. Quote, when Goebbels, the brain behind Nazi propaganda, had culture being discussed, he brought out his revolver. That shows that the Nazis, who were and are the most tragic expression of imperialism and of its thirst for domination, even if they were all degenerates like Hitler, had a clear idea of the value of culture as a factor of resistance to foreign domination. Cabral goes on and says, with a strong indigenous cultural life, foreign domination cannot be sure of its perpetuation. And it is in that spirit and understanding, the spirit and understanding of the significance of indigenous culture and knowledge systems, that we gather here this afternoon to have a conversation on reversing cultural erosion. And who better to guide us in this discussion than someone whose contribution to cultural studies has been expansive, extensive, comprehensive, and innovative, to the point of becoming an internationally influential interdisciplinary scholar in the areas of Black studies, cultural studies, gender theory, transnational and diaspora studies, and Black queer studies. Someone functioning as both a pioneering researcher and a public intellectual. Someone who currently, and I confirmed this before he came here, is the chair of the Department of Africana and American Studies at the University of Buffalo. Folks, do join me in giving a warm welcome to the peerless Professor Rinaldo Walcott.
Thank you, Mohamed, for that generous, and mostly false introduction. It's a real pleasure to be on the stage at Nairobi Lit Fest, and I have to invoke Malunga, who's a co-sponsor of this, and the Hay Festival, for helping to get me here as well. I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, and I'm not going to just let you ask me questions. I'm going to have some for you too.
I hope not. So this is the format. I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. A few questions, because I see people in the audience who are 10 times smarter than I am. I'm sure they have way better questions. But I want us to start with a foundational question before we move into the specifics. The term cultural erosion, depending on which circles you're in, can be viewed differently. When you're around, the development policy circles, you'll hear it used as a soft descriptor. But from a critical cultural studies lens, it means something more. It reflects centuries of dispossession of language, of land, of memory, of even cosmologies. So my question is, how do we understand cultural loss and erosion, not as a passive disappearance, but as an active, structured process of domination?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question, and it's a really big question. But I think that the first thing that I begin with is that there's nothing that's been lost. But what has happened is that things have been submerged, there've been attempts to discredit things, and things have been placed in positions for which they can't get any breath, which is to say that all of the kinds of knowledges that we claim that we need to resurface or reclaim are still with us. They've gone nowhere. What has happened is we've been forced to engage in what myself and others would call the partial view of Europe's understanding of the world, as though it's the only view of the world. And that's the struggle that we're in, to overturn that partial view as though it's the only and the total view of what it means to live a life on this planet.
Brilliant. Many discussions of cultural recovery they focus on symbolic or spiritual dimensions, which is fine. I mean, we can get to that in a bit. But culture and indigenous knowledge systems, they often contain sophisticated approaches to the question of land, the question of economics, of resource management, and so on and so forth. And my question is, how can communities recover and adapt traditional or cultural economic practices, whether it's indigenous African communal land systems, whether it's even the Caribbean maroon economies, to build contemporary economic power that challenges rather than participates in exploitative and extractive capitalist structures.
Again, you asked me some big, difficult, tough questions, but
You
I'm
got
gonna
this.
begin. I'm gonna begin where you end, which is to say that as someone who's still committed to a notion of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore would call small c communism, and of course, ultimately, the struggle is a struggle against capital and the way in which capitalism frames and shapes our lives. But I'm also always skeptical of a certain kind of return to a past. And yesterday, Montaza and Panesh were talking about this idea of returning to a primordial past, a time before the colonial adventure began to reshape our lives, as though that offers a certain kind of promise, a promise of a certain kind of liberation and freedom. And I'm not of that school. So I'm not romantic about the past. But what I'm interested in is what are the ways and the ideas and the practices that are still with us that supersede capital, that capital has not been able to capture. Because one of the things that we have to grapple with continually is the precociousness and the capaciousness of capital. Capital is able to gobble up even its critics and return them as a product. So we have to be always aware of the workings of capital, of its seductions, and of the way in which it easily incorporates even counter arguments to it. So the work then of returning to or making much more apparent cultural practices that capital itself in previous iterations have tried to discredit or to submerge. It's important political interventionist work. It's the kind of work that I think you and your colleagues and your generation is doing here in Kenya. It's the kind of work that the late Ngugi wa Thiong'o tried to do when he turned towards writing only in his mother tongue. These are all actual practices that are not simply symbolic, but they're meant to make available another worldview, a worldview that is not behind us, that's never been lost, but a worldview that, in the onset of colonial capital, has had to struggle to be offered as another way of living a life, another way of seeing the world, another way of experiencing what it means to live a life.
That's brilliant. And you mentioned Ngugi. I want to shift the conversation a bit to the mechanisms of cultural transmission themselves. I mean, a month ago we did lose Ngugi, sadly, one of our greatest decolonial thinkers. And as we all know, Ngugi privileged culture as the primary, privileged language as the primary carrier of culture and as the primary repository of culture. In my own language, in Somali, we have a saying that says "Afkago asirta," the meaning, your language is your secret, it's your power, it's the one thing that someone can take away from you. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role of language and linguistics in reversing cultural erosion, particularly because in some of your work, you suggest that diaspora cultures have developed other forms of transmission, performance, music, embodied knowledge, theater, and so on and so forth. And in a way, they're still connected to language. But how do you understand these alternative modes of cultural preservation in relation to the linguistic focus of earlier decolonial thinkers like Ngugi?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I was born in the cradle of modernity. I was born in the Caribbean. And, the Caribbean is a place that people can think of in a range of different kinds of ways. The Caribbean is, in many ways, a profound site of invention, but it's also a place that holds all of the world's civilizations in interesting tension and in ongoing connection, disconnection, and change. So often when I hear or am or asked to think about questions like the erosion of culture or the erosion of language, as a Caribbean person whose mother tongue would be called English, but not exactly, right? the kind of question of where does change and transformation fit into these conversations becomes really important for me. So, for instance, if you're thinking about language and the way in which Ngugi made the argument in decolonizing the mind of working in one's mother tongue, a really important intervention that remains still important for many parts of the world. Doesn't exactly map onto the Caribbean in the same way, except that it does too, right? Which is to say that to write in what we will call them vernaculars of English, or what M. Norbesi Philip calls them demotics, or what have you, which are not exactly what people would use the language of standard English, but they are mother tongues too. And so, of course, there's been a whole tradition in the Caribbean of writing in those other Englishes. But then there's also a kind of larger political project that English no longer belongs to the British, that there are many Englishes, and that the way in which we have taken over and owned that language produces a whole different kind of grammar and syntax of what it means to speak and write in that language. So as you can see, there are a number of ways, and you can do that all across the Caribbean, whether you're talking about the Dutch Caribbean, the Spanish Caribbean, the French Caribbean, and so on, that there's this constant move between what we might call the standard form of the language and its demotics, its vernaculars, and so on. And of course, we live our lives much more in the vernacular and the demotic than in the so-called standard. But that places itself all the way down in Black diasporic cultures, from everything from how we dress, to how we dance, to how we walk, to the kinds of bodily attitudes that we hold, to our relationships to Europe, to the African continent, and so on. And so part of what I try to do in my work is to be less concerned with the question of loss and much more concerned with the question of change and what that change means at any particular given historical time. Because, as I said earlier, one of the things that we grapple with continually is how in moments of change, capital is able to consume and to repackage and to repurpose and to turn various kinds of practices into commodity form. So for instance, you take something like hip hop. Hip hop is both a tremendous, important, world transforming intervention and invention, and as we speak today, it's also become a world transforming commodity. So, if you're into the music, if you're into the art of hip hop, if you're into the fashion of hip hop, you can trace moments where hip hop is seen as politically troubling and problematic to the forces of capital. And you can trace how over time the very thing that at one moment capital decides should be criminalized, should be placed outside of any kind of market quality, in another moment it becomes fully an element of the market and is marketed then back to us as a desirable commodity. So recently I was thinking about this. Right now in Paris, last week and this week, it's Paris Fashion Week. And if you're interested in fashion, you can go and begin to look at all of the videos that are circulating on YouTube and IG. And one of the most interesting things about contemporary high fashion is the way in which black people are now being offered up as high fashion's decorative moments. And it doesn't matter whether they're simply people sitting in the audience at the fashion shows, or even if they're the creative directors of the large brands like Pharrell at LV, right? They're decorations to capital. And they're fungible, meaning that they're interchangeable. It doesn't matter whether it's Pharrell at LV or it's Rihanna hawking diamonds for Cartier, or it's A$AP Rocky doing his own thing. They have become interchangeable as black faces of the decoration for Western capital. And so, on the one hand, at an earlier iteration, they would have been outside of that logic of capital. But capital can devour them, as one critic says, without any apparent lack of appetite. And that's the struggle. The struggle is not one of loss or erasure. The struggle is one of how do we hold on to cultural and political practices that are meant to transform the social relations of how we live across class and gender and sexuality and race, from not being consumed as yet another product to be sold and marketed to us as though it is doing the thing that we intended it for it to do.
Sorry. That's brilliant. And I just want to further that point that you ended on and point out also a contradiction of sorts, because your own scholarship operates within the university structures that have historically been sites of cultural alienation and domination of black and indigenous communities, right? And this connects to the broader questions that you're just talking about, especially even things like knowledge systems themselves, for instance. So how do we move beyond what we might call the institutional and epistemological coloniality of knowledge? Because we can advocate that marginalized or indigenous communities to recover cultural knowledge systems, but how can they protect against what you had just perfectly described, against the appropriation by these same institutions? We mentioned universities extracting indigenous knowledge systems. You mentioned corporations commodifying these practices. Even governments as well co-opt cultural symbols for legitimacy. So my question is, what would genuinely decolonial indigenous knowledge institutions look like? Institutions that maintain control over how indigenous knowledge is used and by whom, or even contemporary culture, like, for example, hip hop and so on.
That's the easiest question that you ask. And I'll tell you why. When you invoked, at the beginning, you invoke Amilcar Cabral, and immediately I thought of his collected speeches under the title Return to the Source. As a Black Studies scholar, the reason why that's the easiest question is because a Black Studies scholar does not enter the university to preserve the university. A Black Studies scholar enters the university to undo the university, to make the university do what it was not intended to do. Because we know, as Black Studies scholars, that much of the knowledge that is created in the university is launched against Black people, indigenous people, and other colonized people. We know that the university is one of the central pillars of the maintenance of white supremacy and Eurocentrism in particular across the globe. So my work in the university is antagonistic to the university. It is also contained by the university. Don't get me wrong. There are many fights to be fought in the university, and sometimes we make some movement in those fights, but we're often also contained and curtailed by the institution itself because of its own regime of tenure, awards, all of those kinds of things. But nonetheless, what's important to note is that Black Studies and Black Studies scholars understand that the making of knowledge is contested, and that we're in the university to contest that making. So for instance, when I was in the sociology department, I was doing a particular kind of research, and I had colleagues down the hall who were working on behalf of the police, doing research for the police. And I was doing research that was anti-police, right? And that's where the contestation comes in. To understand that the university is not a place of liberation, the university is not a democratic space, or the university is not even a radical space. Indeed, the university is one of the most conservative spaces as a pillar of many societies. But the university has been able to twist what it does into a logic and a rhetoric that it is a space of left collectivity, of radical democracy, of a potential place to test out freedoms that you can't test out in other places. And so it uses that to seduce us into believing that the university is other than it is. But I always say to my students, if you want to know who's behind what kind of policies that governments are doing, go and see what your colleagues are researching. Go and see who is advising the Minister of Education. Go and see who is advising the security services. Eventually, you're going to find a professor or a researcher who's connected to a university there. They're the ones who are feeding the kinds of logics and creating, often through their so-called research programs, so-called evidence for why particular policies need to be put in place. So I have no fantasies about the university. I see my work in the university as being at war with the university. Now that brings us to one other small contradiction. That's really important because I think often people think that how people derive their living has something to do with their relationship to or perpetuation of capital. How you make your living in the context of capital and these systems and regimes of domination and subordination is less important than the structure itself. Like, so we gotta live, we gotta buy food, we gotta get around, and so on. That's very different from working to legitimate that particular distribution of how people have access to the resources to live and make a life. And so the university is also skilled in its role of distributing those resources. And one of the ways in which it distributes those resources is, for instance, to keep black and brown and indigenous people out of, for example, professorial jobs, right? And if the professorial job is a job where you still kind of have some autonomy over your time, and if it's a job that still allows you some fiction or notion that you get to organize your work, that you get to pursue your own interests and so on, then it seems persuasive and seductive. And other people want access to it too. And the university's way of distributing that unequally is to keep certain bodies out. So bodies like mine, people like myself, who enter the university, if we're aware of the university as one of the central pillars of the maintenance of profound forms of inequality, then you know that your position in the university can only be one of antagonism, one of resistance, and one in which you're constantly at war with it.
Can you clap for that? That was brilliant. And it puts so much into perspective. I want to go back a bit to something that you had mentioned earlier when you were, going back to your Caribbean roots and talking about diaspora cultures. I came across a video of yours from 2008 in which you were saying that one of the things that you told your students is that we, and I'm assuming when you say we, is folks in the diaspora are the poor cousins of modernity. Mm-hmm. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, that video has gotten me into so much trouble in so many different ways. So before I say what I meant by that, I was kind of asked, a journalist asked me a question about enslavement, and it went something like, I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but something like, if you could do it differently, would you do it differently? And I proceeded to say, no, I wouldn't do it differently. First, I laughed at it because it was a ridiculous question. And I said, no, I wouldn't do it differently, and here's why. And I gave all these reasons, like, the development of blues and jazz and calypso that comes out of the terrible, terrible encounter between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And part of what I meant by the poor cousins of modernity is, as I was saying earlier, that the Caribbean Basin becomes the site post-Columbus of multiple forms of invention. It's where primitive capitalism takes hold and where capitalism is developed. It's where all kinds of inventions for industrial plantation life is experimented with and developed. It's also where significant forms of cultural transformation happens. People use language of hybridity, creolization, whichever one you feel comfortable in using, and it continues to be that. It's a place of invention where people who were dispossessed from material wealth nonetheless created powerful forms of music, powerful forms of oratory, where in the 20th century the only musical instrument to be invented, the steel drum in Trinidad and Tobago. We can go on and on, all of the kinds of ways in which we talk about democracy, civil laws, and so on, comes out of both the practice of white supremacy and the unfreedom of black people, and indigenous people, and then later the indentureship of Indo-Caribbean people, and so on. It's a place of tremendous forms of migration, right? From Lebanese to Indian to Chinese, and on and on. Japanese, you name it. So the Americas, but the Caribbean Basin in particular, is a place of profound forms of transformation that we often don't even have language to adequately describe. But everything that happened in that region got exported elsewhere, including its people. And so when I invoke the Caribbean, it's not to make the Caribbean exceptional, but really to think about how a geographic space lives well beyond its geography. One of the amazing things about being here on this stage in Nairobi and invoking Watiango, one of my favorite Caribbean poets is Edward Kamau Brathwaite. In the 70s, Brathwaite came to Nairobi, and he came to visit Ngugi, who wasn't here, and ended up meeting his mother and grandmother, who gave Brathwaite the name Kamau. Right? And and one of the things that's been really interesting to me, and it's really interesting to me every time in any time in any part of Africa, is the way in which I hear constantly in the soundscape of the land reggae. And I'm like, okay, this is where the Caribbean rejoins Africa, and this is where Africa joins the Caribbean, through the backdrop of the reggae beat. And I think that's the point of, it's not only that people move, but musics move, rhythms move, and rhythms returned. And that's the kind of cultural transformation that I'm interested in, that some people might experience as a loss. But actually it's not a loss, it's a profound sense of connection, and it's a profound sense of how things survive and transform and reconnect in ways that are deeply political, but also spiritual in ways that we don't really have the language to fully articulate.
Brilliant. I think this is going to be my last question. It's an easy question, hopefully. Earlier when we were seated together, we were talking about how culture can be a double-edged sword of internal contradictions, right? On the one hand, for example, we have all these knowledge systems that we have in our cultures that contain sophisticated understandings of ecological relationships, healing practices, conflict resolution, and so on and so forth, which could address contemporary crises, climate change, mental health issues, and reconciliation. But there's also the other side that can't be ignored, right? And earlier we were speaking about your work on black masculinity and queer diaspora, for example. And in my understanding, at least, it suggests that cultural restoration cannot simply return to pre-colonial forms, in our case, in Africa. It must grapple with how marginalized subjects, including queer folk, including women, have been excluded from dominant cultural narratives. So my question is, how can we develop what we might call a revolutionary cultural methodology, one that simultaneously affirms the liberatory potential within indigenous knowledge systems, but also maintain rigorous critical analysis of potentially regressive elements like patriarchy or heteronormativity that may be embedded with some of these cultures?
That's a great question, and a really difficult one to answer. And I'm going to dance around a little bit because, one of the things about a question like that is that sometimes it sets us up to say that the cultures that we are a product of are fundamentally patriarchal or homophobic or transphobic and so on. And I don't buy that. Like, I don't buy that black people, African people, people who've been colonized are any more transphobic or homophobic than anybody else. And I always say to my students, tell me why all across North America They are gay villages that are largely made up of white people. If white people were so together, their children would not be running away from town A and town B and town C to go and make a village somewhere else, right? So white people are not somehow imbued with some kind of liberal or radical response to patriarchy and homophobia and transphobia and so on. That's not, saying that is not an excuse for homophobia and transphobia in contemporary black cultural practices and forms. Like, we are hearing some kind of church over there, and I can only think about the ways in which, the colonial encounter and the expansion of certain forms of Christianity and other religions have helped to produce certain kinds of logics of patriarchy and queerphobia. At the same time, I don't also want to produce a logic that sometime prior to colonization, we also had it all together. I don't believe in that either. But there are moments from moments prior to colonization that are deeply important for how we might experience our present, which is to say that we know the colonial project helped to create and reinforce logics and differences between masculine and feminine, between heterosexuality and its opposite, and so on. And so we don't have to necessarily reclaim anything. I'm the kind of person where I really believe that we begin where we're at, and we ask the question, what are we going to need so that we can live the kind of lives that we all need to live? And that becomes the kind of political challenge, to put on the table the regressive moments of patriarchy, to put on the table queerphobia, to put on the table what are then the kinds of ways that we want to imagine what it means to live a life to its fullest forms of satisfaction. So yeah, I'm a black queer man who's been involved in thinking about black global life, usually from the geography of Canada and then spreading out elsewhere, as a way of saying that black life doesn't have to make itself small or cut off in any way from any other kind of thing, any kind of possibility. That black life is expansive enough that it can enfold and have within it everything that it desires to live a life. But I also think and write that with a conviction, knowing that I'm actually not writing that alone, and that I'm not the first person to have said that, and that I'm actually writing and thinking in a tradition, whether I'm invoking James Baldwin or Audre Lorde or Dion Brand or Makeda Silvera, or even more problematic figures. The fact is, the black people and I like to think about the post-Columbus period. So black people over the last little over 500 years have been radically at every epoch rethinking what it means to live a life. And when we rethink what it means to live a life, everybody else's lives is improved because of that. And so for me, the question is never simply one of black people somehow being, regressive, being harsh, being vulgar in their refusal of certain kinds of cultural practices and forms and behaviors, but rather, what's the force behind that? And why is it that, our religious practices or conservative political practices ask us to reject trans people or to reject queer people, or that men should be the leaders in the family? And when we just take, you don't even have to look very hard. When we just take a quick look at it, we then begin to see, oh, actually, black people aren't that different from white folk, from Asian folk, from, East Asian folk. That in all of these cultures, there are folks who harbor those kinds of beliefs. And that those of us who find those beliefs deeply troubling, our work is to make those things not work. So that's what I see my intellectual work is doing, attempting to contribute to ongoing conversations that means that those things don't get to work. There's back, yeah. That's the political project. how do we make a different kind of politics appear? A politics of life and love, without guarantee, though, right? As Stuart Hall would tell us. We don't know where any of this leads us. But the point is, we know that what we have right now does not work, is deeply unsatisfactory, and we want to make something else appear. And that's the project, to make that something else appear.
And that's and I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
You have disappeared too.
Yeah. And that is, that political project is also part of the long emancipation, right? Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, once again, Professor Rinaldo Walcott. I think we have time for Q&A.
Check. Okay. Any questions?
Hi, Professor Walcott. Such a joy to listen to you today. Thank you so much for coming out here. My question is about the perpetuation of capital and this moment in Nairobi and Kenya right now, and putting that in conversation with your book on property, and specifically this contradiction of the state of Kenya right now mobilizing the destruction of property, which should fight against capital in a lot of ways, being used to protect the legitimacy of the state and to protect the government that is expanding neoliberal capitalism in a lot of different ways here. And I'd love for you to hear you speak a little bit about on property looting right now in Kenya and what you've been seeing around you while you've been here in Nairobi.
So let me say that I didn't get to see much of it, except to images online. But as we know, one of the things that capital does is that capital creates the state, and then the state becomes indebted to the perpetuation of capital. So this is why in any moment where people are in opposition to the state and its regime, that the question of property becomes central to how the state responds. So myself, Christina Sharp, and Saidia Hartman, we have this little pamphlet called Looting, and we try to have a conversation about why what the state calls looting is actually a misnomer. That looting is a form of state resistance, that looting is an uprising, that the question of the state and its own perpetuation of capital, the state now comes to stand in for the distribution of capital. And of course, in the neoliberal state, that means it was always unequal, but now it's intensified in its inequitable distribution, right? In every state that we can see, and it doesn't matter whether it's a so-called post-colonial state or it's one of the so-called first world state, G7 states, what we are seeing is the state being the arbiter of massive unequal distribution of the resources to people who are already super wealthy. And so people are rising up against that. Everywhere people are rising up against that. And everywhere people are being met with tremendous forms of violence. And so the question then of property is at stake. And if we're to save this planet, and I mean this sincerely, if we're to save this planet, we are going to have to reclaim and abolish this idea of property. We cannot actually save this planet if the capitalist logic of property continues to prevail. Because as we are seeing, the state is willing to unleash tremendous forms of violence to maintain a system that is literally driving the planet to its end. And when you say that, sometimes people who believe that capitalism is the only way to organize human life, they think that you're being really sensational. But the one thing I would say is, especially for many people who were born after 1989, and I get to teach a lot of people like that, they have never heard of another economic system outside of capitalism. They think it's inevitable, it's the only way to organize human life, and the way in which Mohamed and I began this conversation when I talked about submerged and discredited ideas. The attempt to discredit socialism, to discredit communism, after 89, the idea that capitalism is triumphant and the only way to organize things, the idea to discredit forms of indigenous knowledge that are based in collectivity. These are all of the ways in which the state perpetuates its violence. And so, but we have to become really articulate and forceful in saying no and saying there are other ways that we think we can organize and live collectively better together. And we have to fight for those ways. And they're going to mean different, they're going to play themselves out differently in different environments. This is why Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about a small c capitalism, which is a communism, not capitalism. There can be no small c capitalism. It just doesn't exist. A small c communism in which, what we've come to understand the state as is minimized in favor of a distribution of the resources and communities organizing among themselves, how they distribute those resources at every level of the community, right? From the national to the neighborhood. And this is the struggle that we're in, because the route that we're on in terms of contemporary neoliberal capital is simply a death drive for the most of us.
Thank you for that. I think just in addition to everything you've said, I think looking at the histories of Latin America, the Caribbean, and now looking at Kenya in its present, we're in the throes, rather not in the throes, but we're in direct defense, rather in direct protest and a revolution that's based in not just decolonization, but now like our goal is decoloniality, because the harm has happened. We're dealing with the after effects. But I think asking you this question, and I think sitting imaginarily on that panel with all the names you've mentioned, RWG, our sister Christina Sharp, I'm interested in understanding this analysis of, in defense of protest, there's mechanisms that come, and one of the what we're looking at in ultra futures and futures of hope is abolition. But you've spoken clearly about the dynamics of culture and also the violence that we inherit, not just from colonialism, but also proximity and assimilation. So when we talk about in defense of abolition, and I think what we're seeing in Kenya primarily is also many defenses and also many counter defenses of Afro-pessimism in real time. So what do we look at in this state as a speculation of abolition as a future, or abolition as being?
So where you ended is really important. Abolition as a form of being. But I'm also, I come from a school of thought where I understand what it means to live a life is that we're in constant struggle, which is not a pessimism, which is to say that there are a couple of things that this species that we call the human does. One is it moves, and two, it changes. And that's what struggle is. Struggle is about change. So for instance, the book that I'm working on now, which, it began as a book that was called Desiring Utopia, and now it's turned to a book with a working title that's called something like What We Need Now. I'm still working with a notion of Black utopia, but I'm trying to think about how, when we look at Black music, when we look at Black literature, when we look at Black politics and so on, that it's always trying to answer the question of what we need now, so that the Black future is not about something that's ahead of us, but it's about what we can do today so that tomorrow looks different, so that we experience tomorrow. So the Black utopia is about the present. It's a very different logic of utopia, and a very different logic of what people call the future. That Black futures are right now, in this moment, and what we do in this moment matters for what's going to happen when we walk out of the room. And so part of what this kind of question of what does our struggle mean, it is exactly that. Our struggle is about shaping the present so that a different present becomes available to us. That's what our struggle is. And in many ways then, it's a really modest struggle. But because it's a really modest struggle, it's a struggle that terrifies the forces, the current regimes of power. Because those current regimes of power have a very different idea of what the future is. And the future for them is amassing more and more wealth, impoverishing more and more people so that they can have more control over how we live what a life is. So instead of expanding the possibilities of what a life could be, they're actually contracting the possibilities of what a life can be, right? And this is part of, this is a part of, we've been engaged in a significant war since the 60s, and there's a reason why I think you probably began with Cabral. Any of the meager gains of the 60s, when it really did look like global revolution was possible, have been continually pushed back against, especially in what we call the first world, the G7 countries. They have been playing a long game of making sure that what happened in the 60s never happens again. And unfortunately, whether we're talking about the Caribbean or we're talking about the African continent, we're talking about Kenya, we're talking about Ruto, or we're talking about Mia in Barbados, our own global elites are a part of that game, and they're a part of that process. And they actually share more ideologically in common with the folks at the G7 than they share with the people in their own nation states. And this is part of the struggle that we find ourselves in. How do we break through that, right? They're much more in service of global capital than they're in service of distribution of the resources so that everyone can live the kind of expansive life that they should be able to live without violence, without degradation. And so the struggle is one of extending and expanding a set of ideas that have been beautifully bequeathed to us, from Nkrumah to Cabral, Lumumba, one can go on and on and on, that we are yet to realize, and that they understand are dangerous ideas, because these ideas call for the redistribution. And not only that, radically enough, for the end of certain kinds of logics encoded in capitalism, like constant growth. Indigenous knowledges that are still with us are largely anti-growth logics, which means that they're logics that are outside of capital. And that is terrifying. Those kinds of ideas have to be discredited. They have to be submerged. They have to produce a logic that they're somehow no longer with us, so that we don't come into them in their fullest possibility.
Thank you so much for this. I thought I knew what I was going to ask you, and then you half answered my question, which I think is a good thing. But I still maybe wondered if you might touch on it. You mentioned earlier talking about Kamal Braffett coming to look for Wat Yongo here. We also know he also was looking to CLR James and looking towards Laming. We have these constant exchanges and encounters with each other across and within the black diasporas across the world. And as somebody who came up born in the 80s and came up reading and so on in the 90s, I grew up, I suppose, in that time where we felt very connected as a diaspora. It felt as though the people, the black Americans were looking to the Caribbean, black Caribbean people were looking to black African people, and it felt like a very different kind of moment where we were the inheritors of these logics and these theorists, and so from the 60s and the 70s, where most of our parents were born. And as somebody who's now approaching middle age and looking online and looking at a kind of a diaspora wars strangeness sort of developing again, the FBA, the ADOS kind of logics that are masquerading as some sort of progressive strangeness. I wonder if you had any thoughts about, because it comes back to what you're saying, as though it's at every stage we seem to be having to reinvent things that I thought that we had put to bed And we keep having to do it again and again, and how exhausting that is to be doing this work and writing and teaching and working in these spaces and having to go over these kinds of things. I just wondered if you would speak to that moment that we're in, when we're in such crisis and we seem to be, almost as a community, regressing in some ways. I wonder if you would speak to that.
I think the post-Columbus world does two things that simultaneously work against the kind of profound connections that we sometimes have and then disappear. And one is capital, and the way in which capital and its distribution, unequal distribution, sorts people out and sorts out relationships. So one of the contradictions for many black people who live in the West, who live in what I'm shorthand calling the G7 countries, that even though we might be poor in those countries, we still have more access to resources than black people elsewhere. And that sorts out a set of relations that can become really difficult, if you will. And you see that play out in what we've come to call the diaspora wars on the one hand. But the other thing is that in the moment of post-coloniality, or flag independence, as we would prefer to call it in the Caribbean, one of the things that Western liberal post-enlightenment has been really good at is convincing every group, after they were done plundering them, that actually you need to have your own nation state. That the nation state, having your own nation state, is the highest element of what it means to be human in a community. And what that has done is, it's convinced a lot of us that the meaning state is also the highest understanding of ourselves. And so part of what we see play out around some of this stuff that we call diaspora wars is people not being able to distinguish between a set of cultural practices and a set of national claims. The wonderful sociologist and thinker Nandita Sharma has a book that came out in, I think, 2020 called Home Rule. And she does a really wonderful analysis of both the logic of the nation state and claims around sovereignty. And she points out that in every instance, in the post-colonial period where these new nations emerge, that one of the things that they've had to do is they've had to invent a minority themselves to govern, to be in opposition to. And that minority could be another ethnic minority, it could be queer people, it could be, but they always imagine a minority that becomes a threat to the nation state to hold it together, to give it a certain kind of identity. And that one of the things that the language of sovereignty repurpose has done is it's helped to set up the boundaries of the nation state. So if you're going to be a real people, then sovereignty, your struggle is not against capital and its unequal distribution. It's for sovereignty. Once you've got your sovereignty, then you can organize your own relations of capital, and that's supposed to be freedom. Well, actually, we know how extra-governmental organizations work and so on, like the UN, that actually having sovereignty means nothing. If you're subordinated in capital, it literally means, in global capital, it literally means nothing. So that turns internal to managing minorities inside the nation state. And this is part of what we see played out when, people don't understand that, in fact, something like Mento and the blues emerged at almost the same time in different geographies because of what got transported across the Atlantic. Or that, the fact that, dreadlocks and certain kinds of hairstyles that we see on the African continent have deep resonances in relationships, right? But instead, dreadlocks belong to Jamaica, and this other hairstyle belongs to this geography. But these are the fictions that post-Enlightenment modernity have offered up to us as ways of keeping us separate and ways of continuing its own project of accumulation. Because that's what, post-Enlightenment modernity has been. It's been about accumulation, and placing that accumulation in particular geographies. Geographies of whiteness, largely in Europe, in North America, and Australia, and New Zealand. And our struggle is to refuse that, but not only to refuse that, but to offer another account of how we could live differently together. And that's what the poets and the novelists and the filmmakers and the musicians, I think, do most beautifully. They offer us another account of how we can live together. And that account becomes so absolutely terrifying that capital has to gobble it up, turn it into a product, and make us only think of it as an experience, not as a new way of articulating what it means to live a life.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And once again, you've been a great audience. He's been great. Round of applause for you guys.